All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. Gonna have another kind of debate slash conversation with Reid from Cordial Curiosity, the street epistemology channel, where he basically uses the Socratic Method to ask people questions about their beliefs. And also Shane Kennedy, my Protestant Christian friend. And I thought this would be an interesting conversation because even though Shane and I disagree about religion because he's a Christian, and like Reid, I classify myself as an atheist, we kind of share the view that street epistemology itself seems to have baked in biases and faith claims of its own. And as I was kind of writing out the description of this yesterday, I was thinking an interesting place to go with that would be that it seems like street epistemology, not specifically the Socratic method, of course, but street epistemology, the way that it's used in all these specific tactics and stuff, was, if I remember correctly, originally the term street epistemology was coined by Peter Boghossian in his book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. So that seems like that seems like kind of a goal, at least in its original conception, behind street epistemology. And then in that book that Reid and I have read, co-authored with James Lindsay, called How to Have Impossible Conversations, that's much less of a kind of like anti-religious bent to it. But then also I read that book that you suggested to me, Reid, by James Lindsay, called Everybody is Wrong About God. And that itself seems like a really anti-religious book to me. So I wanted to discuss this because it seems like maybe that when you're asking questions to religious people, when you're doing street epistemology, it kind of seems like the goal behind that is to poke holes in their beliefs. So I just wanted to talk about that basically. So I guess I'm not sure whether we should start off with actually, I guess maybe we should start off with Shane, since you said you didn't watch that Daniel Ray video, but you kind of have the same sort of objections that he had. Maybe we should start off with that, and then we can go into some of those common assumptions of people who practice SE that then you sent us, Reid, if you guys want to do that. So do you want to start off with that, Shane?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Um, yeah, so so I'm just going to basically just introduce a couple of my perspective on it without really, fully explicating it or going through it all.
Okay.
So I believe that by definition, everybody has to have a frame. It can be implicit, it can be explicit. One can be aware of it, one can be not aware of it. It can be sometimes you can delineate it verbally, other times you can't, et cetera, but it has to be there, right? So in that respect, I thought from what I see of street epistemology, it seems more of a process for evaluating things and examining things. So in that respect, I kind of had two different areas to kind of explore. One would be, given that it's an algorithm or a process, is there an explicit or an implicit belief system underpinning that? Are there assumptions underpinning it? Exploring that kind of idea. And then the second area where you can look at things is, if there is a frame, or if we can identify some things that are there, what effect would that have in terms of coloring the way the process acts, or does it reveal that there's a meaningful faith claim or a meaningful bias there? So those are the two aspects that I kind of had, and then I have a bunch of questions, because I worked on it before, to kind of tease out what some of these biases or faith claims might be. So those are things that could be explored.
Yeah, it sounds like you and I are coming from a similar place in that respect. So Reid, do you have anything to say about those specific things first, or do you want to get into those specific common assumptions of people who do street epistemology?
Yeah, we can get into the assumptions. I think SE does have goals. People who practice it do have goals. And I think we're trying to make it clear in the course the hierarchy of these goals. In Module 2 is why to do SE. And one of the goals is changing minds, which I think aligns with like the original mission of the first book, although we've broadened it out to whatever people want to change other people's minds about, rather than from atheist and theist. So that can be a goal, but we want to make it clear in that, even in that goal section of the course, that there is really a higher goal that should always be present, which is the evaluation of the reasons and the reasoning process. That should always be the highest goal, because we could be wrong about what we're trying to change people's minds about. Maybe we need to change as well. Or maybe we both need to change. Maybe we need to be at a different place in our confidence levels for both of us. Who knows?
Okay.
We only know through the evaluation of the argument, and we try to do that in a collaborative process.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely appreciate the second part of that in particular. I think that's a good goal to have, because and I think I've seen you articulate that relatively similarly before, and I appreciate that open-mindedness to seeing that your own beliefs could be wrong too, of course. Why is there a secondary goal to try to change people's minds?
That's just a common goal people have for talking with people.
Okay.
When you hear someone make a claim and you viscerally disagree with it, like that's usually a motivation to talk with someone, is to change their mind about that thing that you disagree with them about. So sometimes that is the goal people go into conversations with, and we try to make sure there's a higher value, higher level goal.
Okay. So this is one thing that I was kind of thinking about. And maybe after I say this, maybe we could get Shane's thoughts on this too. This particular aspect seems to me as if the method of street epistemology is presented as being neutral, and when you're doing street epistemology with someone, you're kind of taking a neutral approach or trying to be that way. But it seems like when you're trying to change people's minds, it's often not made explicit what your own position is. So it's like you're approaching this from appearing to approach this from a neutral perspective, even though you have your own biases going into that. Like in terms of if you're talking to a religious person, if you're talking about changing their mind, you want them to not be religious, or if it's a political goal, you want them to not have that political goal, or if it's like your favorite subject, I know, Reid, astrology, it's like you want them to not have astrology beliefs.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that, Shane? Before you say what you think about that, Reid.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely got that impression that it was meant to come across as very neutral. I didn't know it was part of the Peter Boghossian How to Make Atheists. I didn't know that. I didn't know that connection was there.
Oh, really?
So that fits real well. I think. And it's also kind of telling too, because like, I don't know. I wonder how much. I don't know. Peter's been through a lot, so it'd be interesting to see what his objectives would be nowadays. Because now some people are starting to see that there might be religions that are slightly more dangerous to modern folk than
It
Christianity.
seems like maybe he and James Lindsay, and you and I have talked about this before, Reid, that are much more concerned with like wokeness than religion at this point. Probably, would that be fair to say?
Definitely.
Okay.
I think if he could write a book, it would be right now a manual for creating classical liberals or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
getting back to that at least.
Well, there was a fellow there. I just heard talk. What's the name of the institute? He's a huge fan of James Lindsay. He sounds like he's a conservative fellow, maybe, and I think he's religious too. And anyways, he's partnering with James Lindsay. He's involved
O'Fallon?
in. Pardon?
Michael O'Fallon.
That's the guy, I think. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of allyship there, and I think that's kind of like the main thing that I would put forward when it comes to like the bias or perhaps faith claims is just it's better to have it on the table. That's been a hobby horse for mine for a long time, because I think one thing that like the woke people get away with is they skirt the issue, examining what presuppositions, what assumptions they make, and they move the discussion onto, well, of course there is this problem. So like if and then steering by examining the problem, which you could, and they won't do it with the process that street epistemology outlines, which would probably be a better way to do that. But then they have their own definition of what evidence is, right? But again, it's switching the focus of the conversation. So
Yeah,
I guess all I would.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I would say, I was going to say that's a good comparison, because like you were saying, the street epistemology as a method is way more effective than like woke people saying like, bro, America's racist and you're not allowed to question that, or something to that effect. Like it's a much more, street epistemology is a much more useful approach than that, but in a similar way, but to a way less significant degree, because like street epistemologists tend to be a lot more reasonable. It seems like that's kind of a commonality between people who do street epistemology and like the woke people, in that presuming, like taking the place of neutrality, but still having those baked in kind of biases and faith claims.
Yeah, I wouldn't claim SE as neutral. Like, we are very pro-truth, whatever that is. And I wouldn't say that is equivalent to neutral.
Okay. That's interesting too, because that's perhaps one area of similarity between you two guys, more so than me, that and correct me if I'm wrong, Shane, but it seems like truth is a big priority for you, but you have different ways of seeing it. Like, you have a more religious conception of truth, and Reid, you have a less religious conception of it. And to me, I think that prioritizing truth, and you basically said that just now too, Reid, like that the bias or faith claim of prioritizing truth is a better one. And I don't think that prioritizing truth is necessarily an important goal to go around pursuing all the time, even though I myself disagree with people about truth claims all the time. I don't think that should necessarily be at the top of the hierarchy of goals.
What would be at the top of the hierarchy of goals?
I think just trying to have love for people and have hope for the world and be kind to people and try to make the world a better place.
Okay. Yeah. I guess, like, to kind of come back to the issue at hand, it's like the way I would look at it is, SE is probably, I think even a religious person who might disagree with some of the framing issues, like myself, I do, for like for questions that two parties can agree are primarily empirical questions, I would put forward SEs, right on the money. The further you get away from something that can be tackled empirically, the worse the SE methods, the more the SE methods limitations are going to show, in my opinion.
Yeah,
which is to say, go.
Sorry. I was going to
just
say,
an example. If you're asking a straight factual question, is this thing occurring in reality? SE is a great method to do it. If you're asking, once you start getting into theological questions, like a purpose and whatnot, that's where I think some of the limitations and bias would show up. So,
did you mean teleological?
Yeah, like if you're asking questions about what something is, like that method works very well. When you're asking questions like why should, that's where the empirical, more scientifically minded approach starts to break down, right?
Yeah, actually,
that's the way I see things. So
this would be an interesting area that I wanted to discuss with you, Reid, because this seems like another thing another value that gets prioritized in street epistemology is prioritizing empirical claims, or whether our beliefs can be empirically verified. And I think that with a lot of people with a lot of different subjects, to me at least, it doesn't really matter that much whether these beliefs are empirically verifiable, especially if we're not talking about like in terms of religion, for example. A lot of these belief claims are like unverifiable in terms of empiricism, and to me that doesn't really matter, like whether we can empirically verify whether God exists or not. I'm much less interested in that question than I used to be. So that's where I would kind of agree with Shane on that subject. So what do you think about that?
You ask, we were just working on module 1 of the course, which is what is SE, and one part of that is the versatility of SE as a conversational tool set, and a part of the versatility of it is what you can talk about. And there are two main categories of claims we can talk about: is the descriptive claims, and that's where the empirical claims would go in there. And we had a long conversation about potentially other kinds of descriptive claims, like aesthetic descriptive claims or ethical descriptive claims. Like there's a difference between sex outside of marriage is common and sex outside of marriage is wrong. I think both claims we could use SE on both those claims. And there's also besides descriptive, normative claims. That's where you're talking about the should. That's where the should type claims go in. And I'm all about using SE with those kinds of claims as well. So all the above for me.
Okay, so you make a separation between descriptive and prescriptive claims, and perhaps analyze them differently, which I think makes sense. And so would you say that whether a particular claim can be empirically verified is like one of the values kind of close to the top of the hierarchy of street epistemology?
Empirical claims are just easier to reason about, because then you can get into very clear tests for, evidence. You just look in reality, or you hypothesize as some kind of test, and you try to find predictions of what you might find for the hypothesis to confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. That's just how that works. It's very easy. But the other stuff is you just have to argue about it and bring in some other maybe empirical evidence to go into your arguments. And you just have to argue about the relevance of that empirical evidence in relation to those reasons or premises. And it just takes a little longer, but still the same kind of format.
Okay. What do you think about that, Shane?
Well, what I think is like I'm looking at the key principles that that Reid was nice enough to share with us about SE, and like there's no so there's many different ways I could approach it, but like it's hard to to start evaluating normative or moral claims or ethical claims if you don't have a definition of good or better, you know? And there's nothing in these principles that touches upon that. So the question becomes
you got into that a little bit in our last conversation, Reid. Would you like to fill that in terms of like what are better types of foundations from which to approach these questions, which you might want to change people's minds about when you're doing street epistemology?
Well, I agree with Shane that it is really about a large part of the normative claim discussions are about what do you mean by good, because then you have to get that down before you can really make progress. And many people find, they get stuck at like, is it God that grounds good or some other way? If it's not God, then what's the second best way? And like, there's many ways of answering that question. So that's just a conversation you can have, and then you can get into arguments about what you're trying to say should happen or should be done. But what was the question again for you, Andrew? Like, you're muted. You're muted, Andrew.
Sorry, I didn't realize that. I guess what I was trying to get at is the last time we were talking, we were discussing how what you see as better in terms of a way of evaluating claims is for you, whether they're rational or empirically verifiable or scientifically true or scientifically provable, like in terms of what is true, whether it's a scientific truth seems to be superior to you. So like in terms of what is good, what is at least better or what is good is scientific truth and rationality and empiricism more so than religious truth or any other sort of, like, for me, I don't prioritize scientific truth or rationalism or empiricism, but I don't prioritize any religious way of answering those questions. Although I guess I see the scientific ones as better in a way, but to me, it doesn't really matter. It just depends on what is better for the particular person. Like, one of the ways that my mind has changed from the way I used to be is that it's become a pet peeve of mine when anyone wants to go around and trying to convince people to see the world more like the way that they do, because people, like we were talking about before, there can be religious people who are, as you labeled it, have benign religious beliefs, like they're not negatively impacting the world in any way, and you said that you would prefer someone like that to like one of these crazy woke people. So, but I think it can be a problem to go around trying to get people to pursue scientific truth and whether their claims are rational and empirical. I think that can potentially be just as much of a problem as people going around evangelizing about their religious beliefs. Like, one area where Shane and I think agree about this is militant atheists like Sam Harris going around talking about the evils of religion and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would say, I confess, I think all of our beliefs should be rational, but not all of knowledge is empirical. I would say, if you claim to know something, you should have good reasons for it. I don't see how that's controversial.
Okay, so maybe we should get Shane's opinion on this too. Like with someone like Shane, would you say, like, in terms of a good reason for his belief in God, could one of the good reasons behind that be that, it improves his life, that sort of thing?
No.
No? Okay. Well, I think you two guys should discuss this a little bit.
Well, I mean, I'm very there's a variety of ways and angles to approach. So I'm not particularly interested in kind of a debate structure. I'm not really. I just don't have the. I'm too old to debate anymore. Just because I realize it never really gets anyone anywhere. So I'm much more interested in exploring. And so the reason I bring that up is just because there's just so many different aspects to approach. So if one isn't the fun one for both parties, then we can always pick a different one, right? So, so for instance, you can look at. So just take the example of definition of good, right? Good reasons. Okay. So if reasons should serve truth, okay, then you're making some sort of normative claim that like a true thing is inherently better than in some situations than a functional thing is essentially what you're saying. Because if by one's definition of true, something is not true, but if by one's definition of pragmatically functioning well and maximizing Andrew's goodwill, peace, love, or whatever, if that is working, then there's a conflict there. So you're gonna have to reconcile. Well, for this reason, truth ultimately serves a better, has a higher value than whatever pragmatic benefit you would say. And then maybe you would argue that eventually, if you're not being true, whatever pragmatic gains are going to be short term. Maybe you could prove that, and then you could end up serving both at the same time. There's a variety, but you have to go through a process of stacking up these values, right? And the reason why that's relevant is because I really wonder to what extent the SE method itself has been used to determine the values that underpin the definition of good, why truth is at the top of the hierarchy, etc. Because exploring that space of what value to put at the hierarchy, it's very hard to turn that into an empirical question. Like moral philosophy, if there is such a thing, is hardly a raging empirical consensus building operation, right? So it's not obvious that that anybody has quote unquote good reasons for how they're establishing their value hierarchies. So it's such an open-ended question. So that's what I kind of take issue with. It's one thing. It's one thing to say, okay, SE is a good method for evaluating information. It's a method for establishing if reasons exist or not. But the more you start moving to say like moving into the realm of good, it's like you kind of have to put your definition of good on the table and start defending or asserting a credibility as to why what you say is good is actually good. And I just find that, and I'm so not to go on a rant there. So all I just tried to lay out was definition of good matters. It's not obvious how to reconcile it. And I think that part of the reason why we see this woke problem is because there was too long people just said, well, it's obvious that truth is good. It's obvious that having good reasons is good. No one's ever going to game this system and start using stupid evidence and stupid reasons to attack the very process of determining truth. That's never going to happen. No one's going to have to lose any professorships and move to Texas. Like there's no way, because it's so obvious that truth is at the top of the hierarchy, right? So we can just take that as for granted, right? I don't have to have a revelation or a Bible or some big book that I can try to put in front of you defending why my value hierarchy. All I have to do is defend this truth-seeking process. It'll all work out fine. Don't you worry.
Yeah, that's it. I think the one point that you made there that I think is a good one that I often talk about is that from us having all read Jonathan Haidt's work, like The Righteous Mind, it seems to me like one of the main lessons that I've gleaned from Jonathan Haidt's work is that moral philosophy is not empirically or rationally verifiable. Like, our values are not rational or empirical. We naturally evolve to have a moral worldview, whether we're, regardless of how religious and secular we are. So kind of like you were saying there, Shane, we have to have baked in biases and faith claims of some kind when we're talking about moral values, which is why, to me, whether someone has like a religious approach or a non-religious approach or even a woke approach, whether those the answers to those questions are not rational or empirical.
Yeah, I very much resonate with Shane's valuing of pragmatic considerations, and I think my naturalist and pragmatic philosophy of science uses that pragmatic consideration. Like, I have 4 values, like pragmatic considerations for what constitutes a good scientific model. And yeah, the definition of good or better a scientific model is based on 4 pragmatic values. So I resonate definitely with that.
Okay. So it sounds like, based on what you were saying there, maybe you can reconcile like the question I asked about moral value, whether moral values can be rational or empirical, that can be circumvented by whether these are how pragmatic these moral values are, which is it sounds kind of similar to what Shane is trying to get at. Would that be correct?
I'm not sure about the moral values.
Okay.
Potentially, I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, what do you think about that, Shane? Do you think that kind of reconciles your more pragmatic approach to these kind of moral questions?
It gets kind of messy because, like, I would disagree with you, Andrew. I think to a certain extent, I do believe that you can put together a fairly coherent, rational, data-driven conception of what's better or worse. I don't think it's as much of a black hole as people think it is.
Okay.
And I think at minimum, you can, although very don't often do it. I think you can. I think in practical ways you can like both identify disagreements of approaches, but then also identify things that really are very meaningful difference, right? So just i.e. James Lindsay can sit down with a conservative Christian and go, okay, obviously, like, you probably think certain life behaviors are taboo, but that's not as relevant as the fact that we both agree on this, and then we can both agree this is a threat. So I think there's a lot of things that you can have good reasons and agreement on, that you could do in a way that's consistent with SE. So I don't think it's necessarily possible to do. I just think that without it being explicated or put on the table, then it kind of becomes murky, because if you don't know how someone's constructing their value hierarchy, then you have a limited ability to really understand what types of evidence or considerations they're going to see or not see, because like your values determine what you think is important or not important. And I'll just give one example of that. Like, something I've come to realize a lot more, having gone further in my journey of Christianity, is that, like, a lot of people in the Orthodox Church believe the best form of conversion is a living example. So it's not that what you want to do is you want to sit somebody down and say, hey, here are all the great reasons why the Bible is super relevant to you, why my theology is all tight, and I mean, even though I have all those things, I think I do at least, that's not the best thing. You need to be able to show a human being living a pattern, bearing good fruit, because that's convincing, and that speaks to a level of truth that that intellectual affirmation can't. You know, like if I say, oh, this is definitely the best way to live, and I have all the reasons, and I'm completely convinced, and I live like an idiot, it's like, well, it could be true that I know all the right things, but the fact that I don't live very well, and that's obvious, there's a tension there, right? Whereas if someone claims to have knowledge of what peace and love and all these things look like, and you look at the person and they're a living example of peace and love and all these good things, that kind of bears a bit more. So this is where you get into questions of like, well, for certain types of claims, what type of evidence, what type of data, what type of reasons are more important, right? And that kind of comes back to what I started with, where if you're asking empirical questions, SE is good. When you start getting into normative questions or prescriptive questions, or descriptions of those areas, I would worry people might have think they're on more solid ground than they are, because again, I don't know to what extent one is really taking the time to apply even the SE method to one's own, baseline values, and all the implications that'll have on the way you perceive and evaluate things. So
okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, let me try to put that into a question. Like, do you think that these values that are part of SC allow to people living better lives in a more pragmatic way in terms of the values you described, Reid, and if so, why and how so?
Yeah, that's just a classic setup for an outsider test. There can be hundreds, thousands, millions of people who are wise and do good in the world, who are the best kinds of people in the world, believing in completely different religions and gods and different things. And I'm wondering, how can an outsider tell which one is more accurate in their beliefs? And I don't know how we could tell using that test of the good person.
Okay, I think I'm thinking like in terms of what you said there, about the accuracy of beliefs versus how pragmatic those beliefs are. Like, I think that people can have beliefs, to me, that are inaccurate, like some of Shane's religious beliefs, for example, I think are inaccurate, but pragmatically speaking, I don't think that it really matters that they're inaccurate to me, because he lives a good life, and it seems to, like, what to me are inaccurate beliefs seem to make his life better and not cause any problems with the way that he's living his life.
Mm-hmm. Just all things being equal, if you can have a good life and be more aligned with truth, that would be preferable. And I think we can do that without having to sacrifice being more aligned with truth.
Okay.
Okay. Well, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, if I were to say to you, Reid, that that one of the bias of the SE method, and if you want, I could use specific questions to why I would try to assert this. It seems to have a bias towards alignment with truth in an abstracted way. Like, it seems to give a bias to having your abstractions in line, as opposed to, like, let's say, like, your actions being in line with your values, for instance. Because there seems to be an emphasis on, am I using data to reach proper conclusions, and like, can I say out loud that that's true more than other forms of knowing, like there's embodied knowledge. Like, do you guys know Vervaeke at all? Have you ever heard that name?
Yeah, I've seen
Vervaeke.
some of his
Okay.
content.
So
Yeah.
Vervaeke has his. Do you know Vervaeke, Reid?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's different types of knowing, right? And there's I think there's a pretty clear bias in those questions toward. I can't remember all those types of knowing, but there's a bias strongly towards the abstracted version, and and then you run in. So like, what would be your response to? Well, what are your initial reactions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think his vocabulary is propositional knowing is maybe what I'm talking about, rather than
Yes.
What does he call it?
There's perspectival, I think participatory.
Propositional.
There's the one of doing it. There's the one of being the location. And then there's a fourth one I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yeah.
being able to proposition, knowing it because you can do it, knowing it because you're in the right perspective, and then there's another one I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument of like breaking up the different kinds of truth. And I wonder if SE could be applied in those kinds of knowledges outside of propositional knowledge. Like he's also very into, questioning and Plato and the Socratic Method, I think. And I wonder, in order to become wise, we can use this questioning process in all kinds of knowledge, potentially, even though we, with SE, focus on the propositional knowing pretty much exclusively.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is this can get complicated too. Like if we're evaluating beliefs in terms of accuracy or in terms of the degree of truth, then perhaps we should also ask, like say whether this is true in terms of what type of truth we're talking about. And it sounds like you value the propositional truth of a claim, and perhaps that's one of the way in which often when people are doing street epistemology, they're trying to verify the truth of someone's belief without saying that they mean truth in terms of propositional knowledge, which is where it can seem that street epistemology can seem to be neutral, whereas it actually has that bias of prioritizing propositional truth without revealing that that's the case.
Yeah, that's just how it works in conversation. You need something to talk about, and that's how, like, we need a proposition in order to discuss. Like with the other kinds of knowing, I don't know if you can have a conversation about those things. They're just more individual kinds of knowing, potentially.
Well, I think you can. I think to a certain extent you can. It's just as a data. I think you can invite it in as a data point, right? So it's like, if you're going to invite the data point of participatory knowledge, like one example that Jonathan Peugeot brought up the other day was to really understand some of these cultures, like some of the foreign cultures. Like if you don't actively, for instance, once you've actively participated as a Christian in a Christian group, in a Christian environment, your understanding of what Christianity is going to be very different than if the only data point you have is you've read a lot of propositions about Christianity. The same way, if I just read a bunch of propositions about football, being on a football team, it'd be different than if I'd also participated in the football team, right? So it's like, I think even though, yes, by definition, when you start talking, you're dealing with articulated knowledge, like that's the medium. Otherwise, you can't directly share participatory knowledge, but you can, you know what I mean? You can still gear your propositions to respect the other forms of knowing and incorporate it more knowingly, given that you are in a certain medium, right? Or you could also ask the question, the things I had is, what type of claims are better to be valued propositionally and which type of claims are harder to? Just to kind of be more aware of your limitations, because often that's something I find, it's, for me personally, it's the hubris. And I think nobody, especially if you value truth, it's like you wouldn't want to have a blind spot and not own it or be aware of it. And it's like, I don't know, people can often get astray from ignorance is a very deadly one. Because it's usually when you don't know you're doing something wrong, you're not aware of it, that you're able to do the worst varieties of it, assuming you don't have a psychopathic or self-deceptive nature in the first place. But most people would hope they aren't that way, right? So,
so the scrolling question is SE based on any faith claims, or is it biased? I think I've admitted that it is biased towards the truth. Should we focus on the faith claim part of it?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, the faith claim would be that truth is at the top of the value hierarchy.
That truth is a good thing to value.
And propositional truth specifically, you said, right?
Even just truth.
Okay.
Even just
truth.
I
agree. I agree. Evaluating that question is valuable too, because I think like I said, I agree less with you guys about this than you actually agree with each other about it. Although I think you two are talking about different types of truth.
It would also have to be like, I guess it would also depend on the definition. Maybe we should get Reid to define what would he consider a faith claim. In a nutshell, I think that there's think of it in the lawyer sense. There's like things that are balance of probabilities to be true. That's the civil standard, right? I think if you have at least that balance of probabilities, probably not a faith claim. Once you can't amass an evidence that could win in a civil court, if you don't have that level of evidence, then you're getting closer and closer to something that's a faith claim. So it would be, and again, it's not obvious that anybody has, although it's possible, enough concrete evidence amassed to justify putting truth at the top of a value hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's only fair to use the definition Peter used in the first book, like faith is pretending to know something that you don't know. That's maybe what I would go with.
See, I don't know the truth. I think that's that in itself is a biased definition of faith claims that seems to view faith claims as a pejorative, because like I was saying, in terms of moral philosophy, for example, I think that we all have faith claims, but they don't have to be religious faith claims, which is maybe where I disagree with Shane, where I don't go that far. Like, I have faith claims like, my family and friends love me, and that sort of things. Those are the sort of faith claims that I just go with, and I don't need to verify. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessarily like a pejorative in the way that the definition makes it sound. I think that maybe my definition of faith claims would be something more like values that we just take for granted, that we don't question, but we don't necessarily it's not necessarily that we pretend to know these things even though we don't know them, if that makes sense. And I think it would be good to contrast this with your definition of faith claims too, Shane.
Well, his definition is similar enough to mine. I don't take issue with it.
Okay.
It's like, but how do you know? How do you then apply it to the thing? How is it a faith claim that truth is on the top of the hierarchy, or do we know that's supposed to be there?
See, to me that is a faith claim. Would you say that's a faith claim, Reid?
I would think it's a faith claim. Obviously, a faith claim.
I would think so too.
I have reasons for that, though.
No, sorry. It's my definition of a faith claim. It might not be your definition of a faith claim, but so are you able to outline some of those reasons
for why truth should be at the top of the hierarchy of values?
Yeah.
So we need to get that. got it. Oh, anyway.
Yeah, you go ahead and answer there.
I guess it comes into the pragmatic part of it. Like, we want our truth to be applicable in reality. We want to be able to do things in reality. And the things that we do in reality can either be good for us or bad for us. And if we want to successfully navigate reality, we need to form models of it. And that will help us pragmatically. So it's a pragmatic reason to value the truth.
Okay, but wolves don't create models of reality, but they seem to be doing okay.
What don't?
Wolves?
Wolves.
They do, I would claim.
They do?
But not
How so?
that they test and like evaluate. They embody a model of reality. By definition, I think they have to, but they're not aware of it. It's highly unlikely they're aware of their own model.
I think brains
Or do
naturally
you think otherwise?
do this.
I agree. I completely agree with that. Yes, they model it. Yeah, but it's not an explicated model that they're evaluating as true. It's not true.
Like in a conscious way, the way humans do.
Like they're not using a definition of truth to improve their model.
Like they probably don't even know
Certainly
what
not your definition of truth.
Yeah.
I guess I define the methodology of science as like the development and testing of Big Four compliant models, and the Big Four are those pragmatic values. And the first one is
What are the Big Four?
It's applicability, efficiency, flexibility, and rational coherence. Those are the Big Four. And I think anything that navigates in reality that's alive is doing this because of evolution has made them do it that way.
Well, and I would put forward those are great
seem like
yardsticks
faith
for
claims.
descriptive claims.
Do what?
Sorry.
I couldn't hear either.
So I'm just basically asking why. I'm just basically asking why.
Yeah, that's what I'm
because like
getting.
Why?
Why those four? Like what rational, exhaustive, trustable process revealed those to be the four? And do you have good reasons to have picked those four? And are you confident you've included the only four that are needed, and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, the four are pragmatic values for the models. The first one, predictive accuracy and precision, that allows us to act in the world. It allows us to apply the model in the world. The next one, explanatory efficiency, that one allows us to make sure our computational activities, what goes on in our brain, don't get bogged down with unnecessary posits. And it helps us to not waste energy that could be better applied elsewhere. That helps. Optimal flexibility. This allows us to be able to avoid and dismiss dogmas, and dogmas are hazardous. We don't want those. And then rational coherence. Any kind of contradiction in our model can paralyze our ability to make important decisions. Those are four of the pragmatic reasons.
Okay.
Those are the reasons why those values are good, but that isn't the reason why those are the right values to have.
Yeah,
It's a very different thing.
And also, I would ask, how do you know that those propositions? How do you know those to be the case?
How do I know those? What are they? Are the things that are actually
these are your reasons? Why do you think these reasons are true?
This is what is. It comes from. What is this? Biological evolutionary neuroscience is the field that would answer that question. And I think I talked with you before. like this is where my knowledge about this kind of stops. But
Okay.
he's
Wouldn't
Mhm.
wouldn't that
Well,
wouldn't that make
Andrew, I think-
wouldn't that make those faith claims by your definition then, since it's like it's knowledge that you don't have access to?
He claims that the Big Four do not rely on a priori, aka faith-based conceptions of existence and knowledge, because they are motivated by evolved constraints upon our cognitive faculties.
But if
Yeah.
you don't know how that is the case, then I don't see how you can actually know that that's true. So it seems to me like a faith claim.
There are reasons that I could find, if I had time, in evolutionary neuroscience. They justify those four values being
Okay.
an evolved constraint upon
Well,
us.
But aren't there a lot of
I think-
scientists who disagree that evolutionary neuroscience can be the reason behind these claims?
You would disagree with that?
Yeah, I would I think that evolutionary neuroscience doesn't go as far as some people claims it does. In a similar way as evolutionary psychology, how people have varying views about the validity of evolutionary psychology. I'm saying that you can say the similar thing about evolutionary neuroscience.
Well, I'll have to look into how they are getting those Big Four operational criteria. So,
Okay.
But if we could justify those criteria as the values that make a scientific model better, the better you comply with those values. Where were we in terms of?
Well, my tack would be that let's assume they do everything you just say they do. It's like, what process did you go through to identify that as the best and only form? How have you confirmed that that's not missing? And how can you confirm that, like, and then for instance, like, is it more important to have an accurate model of description, because it seems mostly descriptive, or is it to be more important to be describing the right things? Because you have limited time to describe things. So you can imagine, it's very plausible to imagine one evolved creature could be better at describing, but waste the time describing and evaluating the wrong things, and it's much less effective than one that's picking the right things to describe more inferior. And you don't know which one is necessarily better. It's going to depend on the environment. My whole point is that, like, would you claim to have that? Would this person claim, or would you have claimed to actually have dug down through all those things before deciding that's going to be the primary prism? So I'm not questioning the validity of the points you're making. I'm questioning the assertion that this is going to help you define justify truth at the top of the hierarchy and not in a faith claim, and B, that you actually engage in a correct enough process to even evaluate how you'd evaluate what should be the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Like,
And maybe one of the things that you're getting at there too is, like, maybe there could be more than 4 criteria, or these criteria could perhaps shift over time, and maybe that's a good reason to evaluate and question the criteria themselves.
Well, there's no theological element there. It's just descriptive. It's just descriptive. It's like that. Pardon me?
They're pragmatic considerations.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. That's a good point, actually. Like, they're pragmatic, but you two guys just disagree about what is pragmatic. And I think maybe that's the fundamental disagreement between all three of us. We disagree about what is most pragmatic. I think that both of your approaches are less pragmatic than my own approach, and we probably, all three of us, think that our own different pragmatic approach is the most pragmatic. That would probably be true.
I'm not taking issue with whether they're pragmatic or not. They're obviously, like, you're talking about building a descriptive model. You're not talking about evaluating how you decide what values go in your hierarchy, and that
For
was
the-
the claim of the issue.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Descriptive models for the
You're
purpose
just-
of acting in reality. Yeah.
You're just delineating what your definition of truth is. You aren't justifying why truth's at the top, or that it's not a faith claim. Like if you look at your four things, you're just saying, given my definition of truth, this is how I go establishing what I deem to be true. You're not explaining why truth's at the top of the hierarchy.
Are you saying truth is at the top of the hierarchy because it's pragmatic?
I'm saying truth is defined by models that are compliant with these big four operational criteria. And I'm saying these criteria are natural. They are an adaptation from
that's fine.
evolution.
But that,
Okay.
again, all that is a description of your definition of truth. It doesn't speak at all to why truth is at the top of the hierarchy, or what rational, not faith-based process you used, or street epistemology used to put truth at the top. You're not speaking to that. You understand what I'm saying, or am I not making sense?
Are you saying it's natural for truth to
Like-
be at the top of the hierarchy?
I'm saying it's natural and impossible for it not to be, for us to use models based on these criteria. But then we can
How is it? Well, that's a
abstract them and really supercharge them.
pretty massive claim to me, though, that it's impossible to not evaluate based on these criteria. That seems like almost impossible to prove.
Yeah, that's where the biological neuroscience comes in. And then we can
I agree with Reid there.
abstract
I
them.
agree with you there, Reid. I agree with that part of it. That's not the part I take issue with. Although Andrew does have a point, like you could dig deeper. I'm taking issue with the fact that nothing about those four criteria or what you said is explaining how you've arrived at truth being at the top of the hierarchy. Or another way to say it is, how do you determine how much energy to put in truth and when you satisfy? You know, because
Yeah, then
this is the most common process. Yeah, sorry.
the bottom part is these values that feeds into the methodology of science, and then the methodology of science feeds into philosophy of ontology and epistemology, like, which is how do we know what's
Well,
good?
I think
then- then
philosophically speaking, you both have different foundations behind your philosophy of what is at the top of your value hierarchy.
Maybe, yeah. Then we just get into an argument of how do we determine what's the best value. And
See,
that's
to me, though, I think like what Shane was trying to get at there.
Andrew froze for me.
Since I've read a lot of philosophy about this, I would. Oh crap! Did I just lose?
Go back like
Did I
30
just lose
seconds.
my internet?
A little bit. Go back like 30 seconds.
I think I cut out a little bit there. Like I've studied it. I've read a lot of philosophy about specifically, I guess you could say like meta philosophy in terms of foundationalism itself, and whether foundationalism is the best type of worldview to have. Because even going back to like ancient skeptics in Greek philosophy, there were different types of skeptics within Greek philosophy, and I really like the Pyrrhonian skeptics because they were the type of skeptics where they disagreed with the skeptics. And if you're still there, Shane, you have pointed it out to me about my beliefs before, which is part of how my own beliefs have changed about this subject. I would say that it is a foundationalist view itself to go with the view of the global skeptics who said that there is no possible way to arrive at and discover what is objectively true. The difference between them and the Pyrrhonian skeptics was that the Pyrrhonian skeptics said that you should it's more accurate to say that it's possible to know what is objectively true, but I don't actually know whether it's possible, and saying one way or the other whether it's possible to know what is objectively true is itself a foundationalist claims. And I like to try to avoid making foundationalist absolute claims in the same way that Pyrrhonian skeptics attempt to do, if that makes sense. So that's why I kind of like critique foundationalism itself, whereas we should always have something at the top of our value hierarchy that is like that we should do that. Like we should maybe try to always question these beliefs, and maybe we actually agree about that. I'm just kind of trying to explain my own mindset more a little bit on this, if that helps make my own view clear a little bit more.
Well, it does. I think there are two tacks, right? Like one, you could there's the tack which I think which you were talking about, which is how do we establish what's on the top of a hierarchy? Then we could have competing systems. The tack I was going for was just a straight internal consistency tack. So it doesn't matter whether my approach is better, whether his approach is flawed. It's just like, is the approach that Reid or Street Epistemology is putting forward, is it even coherent by its own standards? So again, I could use other examples to try to tease this out. But again, I don't, from what again, it could be the case, I'm not saying it hasn't been done, that SE has applied SE to its own assumptions. For instance, that's
like another aspect. That reminds me that another aspect of foundationalism in philosophy in general is that every type of foundationalism that someone has in their philosophy, they all rest on the foundation of a priori faith claims, basically. No. So if you have a foundationalist view, it rests on a priori faith claims. That's like unavoidable if you have a foundationalist view.
Not unless your values are natural.
What do you mean?
But that itself is a foundationalist view.
Do you mind, Andrew, if we just pause? I would like him to explain that, because I completely agree with what you said. So what was your response, Reid?
The four values, the pragmatic values that go into what makes a scientific model good or better, are natural. Not a priori.
How have you proven that?
That goes into the biological neuroscience, which I don't know about. I could go into that more once I figure that out.
Okay, but you haven't proven that the biological neuroscience lens is the best lens to decide how to establish a value hierarchy. You haven't done that.
So
that goes in this is just bootstrapping what knowledge is, and then we can get into an argument for what is the best value. And then we can get into philosophy, epistemology.
How can you decide
if you don't mind
the best? I just want to ask though, like, how can you decide what the best value is without basing it on a priori faith claims?
He already answered that. He said the answer is because he thinks he has these evolutionarily, scientifically created values that, if he goes into all the evidence as to why he's picked those four from evolutionary psychology or whatever it is, biological neuroscience, whatever it is, if you start from the beginning of that, but then the a priori thing is that this scientific method that he's used to derive these four things is going to capture what's relevant for framing the world.
Yeah, I would say philosophy is fundamentally a product of scientific methodology.
But that itself is a philosophical view. That's like logical positivism, basically, which itself is disagreed with by many different types of philosophers.
By methodology, I mean those big four criteria, the models that go with those.
See, what's happening here though is now you're like the problem with this is that even if you could understand all the biology and science that underpins those four things. Unless you become an expert on philosophy and theology, you're not going to be able. You're basically brushed, because that's like a logical positivism like model that you just put out there. Something there's a term for this way of constructing reality and to why that it's appropriate, and there's lots of debates and books about why that could be good, why that could be bad, and maybe it's clear that you're correct for having picked that one. But my question would be, have you actually gone to check that that's the case? That you can discount all the philosophical objections that might be raised as to why you would frame the world that way.
Logical positivism,
you understand what I'm...
logical positivism relates to the third criteria, the optimal flexibility. They wanted verification in order to, confirm their hypotheses, their models. And now we're using falsifiability. You don't have to have that absolute verificationist framework.
Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, it's like you can't, like, if you're in a relationship with your, like, a decision like picking a wife. Okay, you don't have a bunch of empirical research on the best ways to or not pick a wife. You don't have the ability to run an experiment. Marry this one woman, live with her for 30 years, marry another woman, live with her for 30 years, starting at 20. So, like, these four, for that particular problem of me picking my wife, the odds of me being, like, it's not obvious that these are the four things I need to, that are the most relevant for framing and modeling that decision.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's not obvious.
This just bootstraps our knowledge, our theory of knowledge.
That type of thing makes sense to me, though. Like I think maybe what you're getting at there, Shane, is that, like, this kind of scientific lens of reality is not the best approach for all of the decisions that we make in life. Like, if you're choosing who you want to marry, I don't think there's really anything scientific about that.
Well, yeah. Well, it's one would argue that science might not be the best realm to go to inform that decision, and one might also might put forward that if what you're trying to do is describe things without a specific goal in mind, without a moral question that invites a whole bunch of complicated things, then this would probably be the way you want to do it. If I was describing a neurological system, if that was my goal, to explain how a body works or explain how the fitness of a creature in a forest, these four things sound like a great way to do that. And it sounds perfect, right? If I want to describe the fitness of who's the best at what's the best way to go about picking a wife, I don't know if these would be the four things that would be the most relevant, or it's not obvious that they would be the rest. And it's not obvious that this neuroscience stuff that Reid was referring to earlier is going to be able to justify that these are the most important four things that go into describing that particular realm, right? Which comes all the way back to what I said at the beginning, which is when you get, like, there are certain realms where I see this SE approach not being as good, and so you can tease it as what type of data for what type of problems, or you can go the faith claim route, which is, again, it's a faith claim that it's truth at the top. Truth is the most important, perhaps for like super descriptive things, but like whether it's going to work or not might be the most important when I'm picking my wife. It's not. Anyways, I don't see the evidence that this has been, the full applicability has been thought out to the same standards that you would question an astrology person about their astrology. You would question a science. You know what I mean? It's like,
I
would be fine discussing the question, what is the best way to find a wife with SE? That seems perfectly fine.
How?
It depends on what, well,
are you going to do some sort of like rational and empirical calculation or something like that?
People can give reasons, and we can evaluate those reasons and how they're figuring out if those are good reasons.
But are we going to use the definition of truth that has to do with these four things? Like, what's the first one? What's it?
Let's see, the predictive accuracy and precision, which is related to how it's applicable in the world.
Who predicts who they're gonna fall in love with?
Like, do you think people like? I mean, yeah, people probably make a predictive assertion that they predict whether it's going to be fine in the future and whether they're going to be able to get it wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, that one fits pretty well. What's the second one?
Explanatory efficiency. If the reasons you're giving, if you don't want like a really complex model of what the best way to find a wife is, you want the simplest possible that gets the job done.
Well, to me that depends on like, why are you looking for a wife? Because that would influence that question in a lot of different ways. I mean,
potentially.
I don't know. Shane, you're a good person to ask about this because you got married last year, right? Congratulations again, by the way, for that.
Congrats.
But did you go around making these sorts of decisions with these evaluations when like looking for a wife in this way, or?
I kind of did, because I'm okay. I'm tongue in cheek. I'm Aspergery in that kind of way. Like, I'm a big believer in models. I mean, I love epistemology. It's my favorite.
Okay.
My favorite topic. But I mean, the conclusion that I came to is that what's in terms of like, it's the how do I say this properly? Through trial and error, having been in previous relationships, I came to see what considerations are important, and then I judged very concretely on those metrics. Like, it's in that sense, it was.
Yeah. Can we do like a?
It's the.
I apologize. Can we do a part 2 on this? I really want to continue.
Yeah.
But I'm hosting a movie night in 20 minutes, and my guests are already here.
Okay.
So I'm afraid I have to go. Y'all can continue chatting, or we can do a part 2 at some point.
No, I think that's right. I think we kind of.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we introduced things well enough. Gives you some time to reflect upon it, and then and maybe I can come up with some more. Maybe we can come up with some more concrete questions now that we've kind of laid the table, so to speak. But I don't want to intrude you getting to your guests. So
yeah. I think it would be a good idea if you guys want. Nathan said that he was going to release that final conversation with Daniel Ray, who's that Christian who has some objections to street epistemology. And so maybe the four of us, or at least the three of us, ideally the four of us, could talk again after that. So maybe in a couple weeks or something like that, if you guys want to do that.
Totally. But here. I gotta go. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. Thanks again. Yes. Thanks again, Shane, as well. And thanks everyone for watching, and check out our next conversation. Check out my next podcast coming up. I'm going to do a critical race theory chat tomorrow with Dusty and Peter Salmon, the author of a biography on Derrida, who I've talked with philosophy about before. And then this weekend, Parker and Dusty and I are going to talk about the Dune Messiah book. So check out that too, and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Check out Reid and I's last discussion. That's in the description of the video. And Shane and Reid and Shane's friends discussion that we had about abortion a while ago too. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And think about and investigate philosophical questions, and it's fun to talk about them and nerd out about them with your friends. All right, so Anything else you want to say before we end it there, Shane?
Jesus saves.
All right. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone, and adios until next time.